Hi, I'm Andrea Grossman. I am the district administrator of Middlesex Conservation District. We are a not-for-profit quasi-state government organization. Our focus is on soil and water conservation. I have our website here on for you guys to see what our mission is. We've been around since 1947. There are over 3,000 conservation districts throughout the country. Um, and there's multiple here in Massachusetts. There are some that are trying to get up active again, such as Essex and Norfolk. If you want to be a supervisor on those districts, you can always reach out to Megan Sudzinski from the Massachusetts Association of Conservation Districts and get those districts active again. We also do lots of events, such as this event tonight and different workshops. And we will be having a rain garden tour with Evan Abramson coming this summer. But also next week, we are going to be having a film screening with the Minuteman High School FFA. That will be the Biggest Little Farm film at 6 o'clock next Friday at Minuteman High School's theater. The tickets are only $5, not a lot. So feel free to come, invite some other people. Tickets are either online or at the door. We look forward to seeing as many of you who can want to come. And as I said before, if you want to join our board, our board is made up of 7 volunteers who run as supervisors, and we have associate and junior supervisors as well. They are volunteer positions, but they help run meetings and our events. So if you want to join, email me. We also have our spring native plant sale coming up. This May is going to be the pickup and cash sale. That'll be May 1st and May 2nd at Minuteman High School. Pre-ordering will be starting as soon as possible. We just got to get a newsletter out, and you can pre-order some native plants. And then again, that pickup will be on May 1st and 2nd in Lexington, Mass. We have a bunch of plants, wildflowers, shrubs, a fern, a vine. So, promote your natives. We're promoting your natives, and you can increase your garden with more plants. And if you want to get our newsletter, you can always subscribe to our newsletter online. We put out notifications about our events, about plant sales, and other programs that we are doing. And if you ever want to you can always donate to the district. We are, again, a not-for-profit quasi-state. So you can feel free to donate whatever you want, or you can donate with a plant sale purchase whenever you want to do that. So again, we are here for Healthy Soil for Biodiversity presentation with our speaker, Evan Abramson, and I'm going to lead it off to him.
All right. Thanks, Andrea, and thanks for having me. Can you guys see my screen? Okay. Yeah, so my name's Evan. I'm a landscape designer and regional planner, and my company is called Landscape Interactions. We're based in Western Massachusetts, and our projects are throughout the Northeast United States, and soon to be working in South America. So today I will be presenting to you a series of different projects that we've done in Massachusetts, as well as one project from the Hudson Valley in New York, all of which are designed in order to be replicated on other landscapes, small or large. So the idea behind a lot of our work is we get commissioned to do, let's say, a public park design in Wellesley, or a regional plan, or a watershed-based plan. And what we try to do is pick sites to do designs that support biodiversity through pollinator plant interactions, and make those designs unique to the site, but at the same time, allow them to be comprised of many different elements that could be broken apart and applied to different properties. So For a large design, maybe it would have 5 to 7 different zones, and each of those zones could potentially be individual on a smaller property. So I'll run you guys through some of those examples and give you a little background on why this work is so crucial. And then we can have questions at the end. So I suppose if you have questions, put them in the chat, and one of us will find them at the end of the talk, and we'll read them and we'll answer them. Just bear with me one second. I'm having a screen issue here, and then I'll get started. Okay, let's do that. All right, here we go. So I like to start off with the basics. This talk is called Healthy Soil Through Maximum Biodiversity, but what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is a subject that is quite complex. It could take years for someone to synthesize all of the different literature on the subject. What I like to go with is a simple definition that is broad and could be understood in many different ways. So the definition I'm going with is that biodiversity is the number and variety of species of plant and animal life within a landscape or a region, and the diversity of interactions between those species. So it's lots of different things existing together in the same place. That place could be a single property. That place could be an entire region, or a group of states, or a group of counties, or watersheds. And between those different species that exist there, plant, animal, including insect, but also bird, mammal, reptilian, what have you. There's also, obviously fungi and other life forms. The interactions between those species, the more interactions they are, and the more diverse those interactions are, the more biodiverse the landscape or the region is. And essentially, biodiversity is essential for life on Earth. Humans could not exist without it, and neither could all the different animals and plants that we see out on the Earth. But in this time that we're living in, humanity has had quite a bit of an outsized role on the Earth's living systems. And we're living in an age which scientists have agreed upon is unique, in that human influence is the greatest factor determining how life systems on Earth are functioning. This age of the Anthropocene is defined by things like rising carbon dioxide emissions, as well as sea level rise, massive transformations of land across the planet through things like logging and mining or development. And this is resulting in the global mass extinction of species. And currently, as many as 30 to 50% of all species on the planet may be extinct by the middle of this century, in just the next 20 to 30 years. This is essentially a potential collapse of nature. And that is not a good thing. It's not a good thing for humans, because we may not be able to survive without all these different species. And it's certainly not a good thing for the Earth's living systems. Our forests, our fields, our waterways need this diversity, this biodiversity, to be healthy and to be resilient. There's currently 1 million species threatened with extinction globally, including about 25% of native bee species in North America. And as a whole, insects are essential for all ecosystems. So if we don't have insects, we're not going to have life on Earth. The main reason for the loss of these insects and for the collapse of these populations of different species is loss of habitat. So loss of habitat can be understood as when we take something that's natural away from the Earth and we replace it with something that's man-made or human influenced. So basically subtracting nature and replacing it with development, or replacing it with some sort of extractive activities. And in the words of one scientist, we're sleepwalking towards the edge of a cliff. We really have to do something fast. Not just insects are in decline. North America has lost over 1 in 4 birds in the past 50 years. The main reason, loss of habitat. According to the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity, there's 5 main threats to global biodiversity, and the first 2 threats, as a whole, are loss of habitat. So it's really the consensus is that we have to replace habitat. We have to put habitat back, recreate it, and stop removing it. And that's what today's talk is about. It's about how can we design biodiversity? How can we create it? How can we create habitat for these species and put it back onto the Earth's surface to help prevent further biodiversity loss? Now, as far as the climate crisis goes, biodiversity is actually a key ally in responding and building back in the face of the climate crisis, because connected, diverse ecosystems actually help stabilize the climate, and they have a better chance of thriving in a world that's being altered by these emissions. So, for example, the example I like to give is the comparison in resiliency between a lawn, a mowed lawn, and a meadow. A lawn will typically have, somewhere between 3 and 8 species of grasses and sedges and other similar graminoids, the majority of which are not native and have very shallow root systems, just a couple of inches below the ground. They also typically have things like red or white clover and ground ivy, and these are all non-native forms, non-native flowers. So looking at a meadow could have anywhere from 10 to 50 species of different flowering species, grasses, warm season grasses, cool season sedges. And so now let's look at climate change on those 2 landscapes. Let's say we have a flood. If each of those landscapes is flooded, the meadow is going to have a much better chance of bouncing back following that disturbance event, because it's got, many, many times more plant species living in it. And inevitably, some of those plant species are going to do well in a wetter moment with some flooding. Obviously, other ones may not. They may be knocked back or even die. But as a whole, the meadow will still exist. It will shift its composition as a result of the flood, but it will certainly not fail completely and become just, barren soil. The lawn, on the other hand, with a very limited group of species living in it, and the sort of ecological community aspects of the lawn being more limited in terms of the type of conditions that those plants like to grow in, may not be able to sustain extensive flooding and could die back completely and just become barren, or perhaps just 1 or 2 species would remain and there would be large gaps. We could look at the same thing with a drought. If you have extensive drought, we see how people's lawns respond to that. They turn brown, oftentimes they die. People have to reinstall them. Hopefully they're not always doing that. Maybe they're replacing them with something that's more drought tolerant. But a lot of meadows, they can withstand drought for years. And that's because the root system of our native plants are many, many times deeper than the root systems of those lawn grasses and flowers. We're talking about 3 inches versus 3 feet or 6 feet or even 12 feet. So that's just one small example of resilience and how diversity is directly correlated with climate resiliency of our landscapes and of our natural communities. A peer-reviewed paper was published in 2025, which found that over 20% of native North American pollinator species are at risk of extinction. And the same paper also acknowledged that while we know that it's this large number of species that could go extinct, little information exists identifying which species they are. So in other words, based on the models, we know that over 20% are at risk of extinction, but we don't know necessarily which species they are. And that is a crucial piece of missing information that without that, many of our efforts to support pollinators or support biodiversity, they could be misguided because we might be planting plants that are not benefiting the species that are at risk. And the species that are at risk of extinction are the species that we really want to be supporting. Those are the species that we're trying to help to not become removed from the earth, to not become extinct permanently. And in order to support biodiversity, essentially we want to stop species extinctions. We want to have as many species as there ever have been and not lose any. And that's why we need to know which species are at risk before we do a design, before we choose our plants, before we go and create the garden or create the space. If we don't know which species are at risk, we may not be planting things that are going to support biodiversity. We might just be supporting species that were already there, common or abundant species. So, and I have examples of how we're doing that in our work here. So we'll look at that in a few minutes. So why are pollinators so important and why are we talking about them today as part of this presentation? So they're primarily insects that fertilize plants producing seeds and fruit. About 80% of the world's flowering plants depend upon pollinators, like they won't be able to produce seeds or flowers without them. In Massachusetts, 45% of our food crops depend upon bees specifically, and about 1/3 of the global food supply depends upon pollinators. So we can summarize that pollinators are absolutely vital to most habitats and ecosystems that pretty much every other animal needs, including humans. And there's some plants and pollinators that have very specialized relationships. That is known as a pollen specialist bee, for example, or a butterfly or moth that has a host plant, a specialized host plant where they lay their eggs. And it's actually quite a high number of species that have that relationship. It's about 50% of native bees in the Northeast. And so again, this reinforces the idea or the fact that knowing what to plant is so important because not every plant will support every species, if that makes sense. So when designing a landscape or a place, a planting of any sort, it can be useful to look through the eyes of a native bee in order to see how you can create the most diverse place. Because bees as a whole are a very diverse group. And if we support their varied life cycle requirements, we will be supporting a wide variety of other insects beyond bees, such as butterflies, wasps, flies, moths, and so on, as well as birds. So there's about 4,000 native bee species in the United States, and over 400 are presently found in Massachusetts. A global study of 41 different food crops found that wild pollinators were twice as effective as honeybees in producing seeds and fruit. So again, honeybees is not the goal of this work. We are not trying to support honeybees. We're trying to support wild native bees and other flying insects. The average range that a native bee flies from its nest in a place like Massachusetts is only between 200 and 1,800 feet. That's like their average distance if they're not stressed. So it's not that far. About 70% of native bee species in the Northeast and in Massachusetts nest underground. Most are solitary. They don't have a hive. And they use things like bare exposed ground in the full sun, like dry soil that's in the sun without a lot of vegetation growing on it. They look for nesting sites in twigs and stems of plants like Joe Pyeweed or elderberry. They nest in abandoned rodent burrows underground or in leaf piles and in dead trees and in dead branches or snacks. So those are all opportunities on the landscape to support them that you might consider featuring in your garden or in your design site. This is a 200-acre site that we did some work on in the Hudson Valley, and I put a point in the center of each of the zones where we had the habitat on the landscape to illustrate the concept of a corridor. So the tiny pink circles represent the average distance that a small native sweat bee would fly from the center of the circle, whereas the yellow represents the distance that a bumblebee would fly. So you can see that with a scattering of different meadows and hedgerows and a pond restoration across about 200 acres, that would be adequate to create a corridor for larger and medium-sized bees, but not for the smaller bees. The smaller bees would only remain within a very close distance to their nest site. So for those of you that live in suburban communities or housing developments or urban communities, you might consider a corridor concept around the idea of several different neighbors creating small pieces of habitat or small gardens on their own sites. And if they were located close enough together, a wide range of species could move from one property to the next, and they could have a very sustained existence, hopefully over many years. Regarding honeybees, a lot of people became aware of the pollinator issue as a whole because of honeybees. And that's because we lost about 2.25 million honeybee colonies in the United States between 1980 and 2005. A lot of the factors that are affecting honeybees are similar to what's affecting native bees and other insects: loss of habitat, exposure to pesticides, exposure to pathogens, which are different diseases that can kill them, and even climate change, changing temperatures that, suddenly perhaps they think it's warm enough to go out, and then they find it's actually still winter, and then they die. Or they go out, we have a warm spring, an early spring, they go out looking for flowers. Well, the plants already bloomed because it was so warm and they couldn't find their host plant. That's one of the ways in which climate change is affecting pollinators, is mismatching the time that their typical plants are blooming from when they're coming out to look for them. Well, these factors are all affecting honeybees as well. However, honeybee colonies in the US are definitely not declining the way that they were between the 80s and 90s. They're actually, if you look at this graph, you can see that between 2005 and 2010, the number of honeybee colonies increased, and then it's pretty much stabilized at this point. It's also worth mentioning that even if you lose your honeybee colonies, if you're a beekeeper, you can order new ones over the internet and have them delivered to your home within probably 1 or 2 days. So it's really not the issue here. The issue is our wild bees and our native pollinators are the ones that are declining, and they're the ones that we need to support. Between 2010 and 2015, this map shows that the overall number of native bees in the US dropped by about 23%. So we lost nearly a quarter of all native bees in just a 5-year period. The areas of this map that are yellow are the areas that had the lowest numbers of bees in this 5-year study. Now, in this next map, these are the areas in the United States that are estimated to have the use of one particular type of pesticide, which is a neonicotinoid. And so this neonicotinoid, imidacloprid, is directly correlated to bee decline. You can see, if we go back to the previous map, that they're essentially the same image, just with different colors. So what that tells us is that the areas that have the lowest numbers of bees are the areas that have the highest use of pesticides. And so that's our takeaway here. It's that these pesticides, especially neonicotinoids, are contributing to the loss of bees. And we're all here tonight because we care about things like biodiversity and native gardening and pollinators. Well, a big way that we can work to solve that problem, the loss of that, is by encouraging the places that we live and work to not use pesticides and neonicotinoids on the landscapes, whether that's your neighbor or the owner of the building where you live or work, whether it's the school that your kids go to. Surprisingly, a lot of schools use these products around the campus. to kill basically any insects that they see. These are all ways in which we can change things. And even if you look closely at Massachusetts in this map, there's quite a bit of pesticide use. I would say the areas that stand out to me looking at this is the Connecticut River Valley. No surprise, we have a lot of farms, and the eastern and central part of the state where there's a lot of urban and suburban development, and larger, smaller cities. So just to kind of wrap up this honeybee issue, this graph is showing you different genuses of native bees. So at the top is bombus, which are bumblebees, and the different food plants that they pollinate in order to produce the fruit that we gather and eat. So you can see here that bumblebees are quite an important crop pollinator. In fact, they're the only bee that pollinates tomatoes. And so, again, it's not honeybees that we need to save, and certainly not for our ecosystems, and even not for our food systems. Native bees are doing the majority of our food pollination globally. This is a list of peer-reviewed journals that looked at the impact that honeybees have on native bees and other wild insects. And I have a few quotes from those articles. I like the one at the bottom. It's pretty succinct. Conserving honeybees does not help wildlife. Honeybees negatively affect the abundance of both short and long-tongued bumblebees, indicating that competition occurs. And the first quote, 40 hives in 3 months collects enough pollen to support 4 million wild bees. So essentially, for every hive that we put out on a conservation property or on a wild natural landscape, we are removing enough pollen in a typical summer to feed 100,000 native bees per hive. So that's a lot of bees. So raising honeybees to save the bees is like raising chickens to save the birds. Looking at the difference between diversity and abundance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why specific species are important to consider when we're doing pollinator restoration work or pollinator design, habitat design. So as an example, we can look at Massachusetts with bumblebees. In Massachusetts, we've lost 2 out of 11 bumblebee species that were historically found across the state. They're extirpated, meaning that they're locally extinct. They're not ever going to come back to Massachusetts. And there's 2 more species that are most likely, well, actually, I would say with the work that we've been doing, we've been seeing these other 2 species a lot. So I'll say we have a good chance of preventing the other 2 species from becoming extirpated, but there is still a high risk. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. So in New York State, or the Empire State, they did a statewide assessment of pollinators. They found that 24% of native bee species were at risk of extinction from New York, which is known as extirpation. And 11% had already become extirpated from New York State, no longer found anywhere in the state. And between 38 and 60% of native bees, flies, beetles, and moths are either extirpated or at risk of extirpation. So these species, the ones that are at risk, the ones that are not yet extirpated, but they have the risk of becoming, those are the ones that we are targeting in our work at Landscape Interactions. They're the species that we're constantly trying to figure out which species is it in this particular place, and then how can we support them? Which plants are they using? Which are their host plants? Which are their pollen plants, their nectar plants? What's their nesting sites like? Where do they lay their eggs? How can we bring them back to these landscapes? And that's because you might see a lot of bees in your garden, but if they're all the same species, that's not a diverse landscape. And so that's not going to be a good thing. It's not a biodiverse system. So to take the example of the lower Hudson River estuary watershed in New York, so you can see on this map on the right, this watershed which is the land area that drains into the lower half of the Hudson River. It goes all the way from the very bottom of Manhattan, and encompasses the entire island of Manhattan, as well as portions of Staten Island and Brooklyn, all the way up to Troy, New York, which is north of Albany. It includes a large portion of the Hudson River Valley, portions of, Saratoga as county and those other northern counties west of Albany. It includes parts of New Jersey, and it even includes a small part of the Berkshires. Between the year 2000 and the year 2021, 62% of all bumblebee species that were observed in that entire watershed were one single species. And that's out of about 18 different species of bumblebee that have been found in that same watershed since 1877, when data first started becoming collected in a more, scientific manner, let's say. So we have records going back to 1877 for that particular part of the world. And we have records all the way through today. We're combing things like iNaturalist, but we're also looking at peer-reviewed papers, museum collections, collections done by professional entomologists. And it's a striking difference in what was observed in the 18 and 1900s versus what's observed in our century now. We've gone from a pretty even distribution of about 18 species, well, let's say 17 to 18 species, to basically one species dwarfing all the rest. And that species is Bombus impatiens. So the reason why I'm talking about this is because I'm trying to illustrate the point that just because you see a lot of bees doesn't mean that the landscape is actually even pollinator friendly. You could just be planting a random assortment of plants that this one species visits because they're like a true generalist. I mean, Bombus impatiens, they're native, it's a native bee, but they will visit Japanese knotweed, which is invasive. They'll visit Oriental bittersweet and Japanese barberry, which are invasive. I've seen them collecting nectar from those plants. I've seen them on non-native plantings pretty much everywhere. I've seen them on cultivars. And so the point is, having them in your site doesn't mean that the site is anything special. It's not necessarily even doing well for diversity. It's just a lot of bees. When you start to see a wide range of species, bees and other insects of different shapes and sizes, different color patterns, then you can start to see how that landscape is becoming more diverse. The wider the range of plants, and especially native plants, the wider the range of species will show up. So our native plants are crucial to supporting our native pollinators. And presently in New York and New England, we've lost about 25% of our native plant species, and non-native plant species have increased about 20%. And UMass Amherst has found that invasive plants and animals spread about 100 times faster than native species. So with regards to native plants, I like to also distinguish between native plants and cultivars of native plants. So cultivars are plants that are horticulturally modified. They're bred by humans, in nurseries and, places like that to have certain traits. Common cultivars would have things like showier flowers, or maybe they would bloom for a longer period of time, or be resistant to a certain type of disease. However, the literature tells us that the more specialized pollinators, the ones that are more at risk of extinction, they prefer native species to cultivars of native species. And that's because the species that tend to be at risk, the ones that we quote unquote want to save, they are less, they have a more narrow diet in many cases. They have a narrow range of plants that they visit. And oftentimes, even the places where they live are more specific in terms of the quality of the landscape. Like there's many butterfly and moth specialists that only live in wetlands or wet meadows or wetland edges, for example. So if we plant plants that are truly native and they're not horticulturally modified, we have a greater chance of supporting diversity because we will be inevitably supporting the species that have more specialized preferences, which are the species that are either more rare or more at risk of extinction. Now, if you're wondering how can you tell if a plant is native or if it's a cultivar of a native, there's a really easy way. So all plants, as well as animals, have Latin names, and their name is going to be two words in italics, and they're both going to be Latin. So to give the example of this flower here, this is a cultivar of a native flower, which is called Monarda didyma. So if you saw a plant labeled in a nursery or a garden center and it just said, scarlet bee balm, Monarda didyma, then okay, this is native. But if it has a third name after the Latin name and it's in English or it's even the name of a person, then that's a cultivar. So for example, the cultivar is called Monarda Jacob Klein. And usually the cultivar name portion, not only is it in English, but it will oftentimes have single quotation marks around it. So if you're in a garden center, in a nursery, and you're wondering, you can ask the people that work there, is this a straight native species or is this a cultivar of a native species? And if they're not sure, ask to see the name of the plant, the Latin name of the plant. And just buy plants that only have Latin names, that have no English names connected to them. The US Army Corps of Engineers in Seattle published a white paper a few years ago in which they concluded that the use of nativars, which are cultivars of natives, may result in the mitigation site not succeeding in the long run or not providing a solid base to the food web, affecting wildlife populations over time. And so they essentially prohibited the use of any cultivars of native species on any sites that they needed to, grant the permit for, or that they were in charge of building or designing. And that's because they looked at the literature and they saw an overwhelming portion of studies found that the nativars were not supporting the same wide diversity of species. They may have sterile seeds, they may not have pollen, they might bloom at the wrong time of the year from when their associated pollinators are out. And one study found that a particular nativar produced 80% less nectar than its wild relative. That's another example, less nectar, which is less food. Looking at birds, Doug Talamy and Desiree Naranjo did a study in the suburban area outside Washington, D.C., and they surveyed 160 different yards. And they found that if the yard had less than 70% native plant species in terms of total biomass, then it couldn't support a single nest of Carolina chickadees. So I think that's a really good way to see how the pollinator issue with plants is really similar to the bird and the other animal use. They all really are needing these native plants. Okay, so here's some case studies from our work and the different ways in which we are attempting to address these issues that I'm talking about tonight. So this first project, Habit to Habitat, it's a public park that we designed in Wellesley, right next to the main library. So if any of you are in and around Wellesley and you want to check it out, just go to the large main library branch on Washington Street, right in the middle of town. And you'll see that on one side, there's parking, and on the other side, there's a park. And that's where our design is. So when we started the project, this is what the design site looked like. It was a large area of mowed grass, surrounded by a mix of native and ornamental trees. And you can see the library in the distance here on the picture on the left. We wanted to gather baseline data on the site before we did any changes, before we removed any grass or did any native plantings, so that we could have a sort of benchmark. This is what the site was like before. And after we do our project, we're going to measure it again. So Dr. Robert Jagir, who many of you are probably familiar with, He surveyed the site 3 times over the course of the growing season before we did any changes to the landscape. We didn't touch a single plant. He went twice in August of 2022 and once in May of 2023. And over the course of those 3 different surveys, all of which were conducted in favorable weather conditions when, bees and butterflies are normally out, not a single bee or butterfly was observed anywhere on the site. We did an analysis of museum records and, contemporary observations of bees and butterflies in order to determine which species should we be considering to, attract to this landscape. Which species do we want to support? Which species are at the highest risk of extinction from the Wellesley area? And this was our list of species. So it includes 45 native bee species and 31 butterfly species. Then we built a design out of the plants that those species use. So I'm going to give you a few examples of some of those species and their relationships with different plants. So the eastern willow miner bee, it's a great example of a pollen specialist bee. They only gather pollen from native willow. The blueberry cellophane bee only gathers pollen from Ericaceae, which are basically plants in the blueberry or cranberry genuses, Vaccinium, or bearberry. And the common loosestrife oil bee gathers not only pollen, but also floral oils from native loosestrife, which is yellow in color and not invasive. So these 3 bees are a great example. If you don't have these particular plants, they're not going to be coming to your site. You're not going to be able to attract them. Looking at butterflies, the frosted elfin is actually listed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife as highly at risk in not only in Massachusetts but throughout the Northeast. It only uses 2 different plants to lay its eggs, which is known as its host plant, lupin and yellow wild indigo. And typically the yellow wild indigo is used in the coastal populations of frosted elfin, the ones that are found, on Cape Cod and the outer islands. And when you go inland, they're more associated with lupin, like places like Montague. The juniper hairstreak butterfly only lays its eggs on eastern red cedar. So that's a really specialized relationship. It's 1 species of plant for 1 species of butterfly. The crossline skipper, it has a smaller group. It has a bit of a bigger group of plants, but still pretty narrow. It only uses warm season grasses to lay its eggs. So typically in the Northeast, it's laying its eggs on little blue stem and purple top. And all of these plants are in our design in Wellesley, and many, many more. So this is what the design looks like from the bird's eye view. We, you can see here the green areas represent the green areas that kind of look like a cloud. Those represent the tree cover, the current area that's forested. And there's a stream under the forest on the right side of the site. You can see the libraries here on the left in black and white. And this whole area in the middle that's filled with different colors and shapes, that was the area that was grass. So we essentially, well, I say we, I essentially looked at this site and I decided to basically center the design on the grass area. And I think that makes a lot of sense. We don't want to be removing trees unnecessarily. We have a large space to work with. It was over 1/3 of an acre. And so the grass area presented more than enough space to create a design. And so the design essentially is a curving mowed path with a circular gathering space that connects to, on the north, to Washington Street, which is the main road in Wellesley, where there's a sidewalk and people constantly walking by. And on the south, it connects to an existing trail in the woods, which leads to a nearby elementary school. So this path moves through a few different zones. It moves through, in the south, a circular meadow. Then it transitions to a low-growing native replacement for a lawn, which I call the bee and butterfly lawn. It's all made of plants that attract bees and host plants for butterflies. It's got some woodland edge plantings. It's got a reading nook, which is a small grouping of serviceberry with some larger trees to create shade. And there's different granite benches, which are represented here by boulders. We ended up using granite benches instead. And then there's a circular gathering space and a flowering grassland wrapping around it as the woodland edge continues on the right. So I'm going through this with you because, for those of you that are home gardeners or have smaller properties to consider, you don't necessarily have to do all of this on one site. You could just do the meadow, or you could just do the bee and butterfly lawn replacement, or you could just do woodland edge plantings, and you would still be providing so much to these at-risk pollinator species. So this is what the site will inevitably look like in the future when it's fully grown in. And in fact, we've been observing the site for 2 years since we planted it in 2023, and it's actually establishing quite quickly. So I don't think that this image is unrealistic, really, besides the fact that most of the plants are blooming at the same time, which is not usually the case in nature. But the actual, the sort of density of the plantings and the heights are a real thing. We called out a few of the plants that are featured in the landscape and then which pollinators they support, just as an example of how you can think about these different plants and their uses. So everything from low bush blueberry, you can see that Calides validus down at the bottom that I mentioned before, purple giant hyssop, it provides pollen and nectar to many different species, including this megachile bee, the clouded sulfur butterfly, goldenrod, there's several goldenrod specialists, and so on. And then this is a diagram of all the different plants that are on the site, arranged according to their bloom time. So starting at the top in March into April, we have the eastern red cedar, down through the scrub oak, the serviceberry, the willows and the serviceberry, the redbud, and then the herbaceous vegetation and the shrubs, all the way to the end of the season at the bottom, when you'll find things like asters and goldenrods, and the warm season grasses producing seeds. And then we called out on the right some of those pollinator species that we're supporting and when they might be on the landscape, like whether they're flying all season or just early season, mid-season, or late season. So in order to accomplish this site, we first had to remove the grass. The site is within the wetland buffer of the stream. It's near the library, and the town wanted to take an organic approach without the use of herbicides. So we decided to tarp it. We tarped the site for 5 months with silage tarp, which is like a thick type of plastic with black on one side, white on the other. And we put sandbags along the borders of all the plastic about every 3 to 5 feet. And then we painted the plastic with different stencils that we created with cardboard, representing different bees and butterflies and plants. And despite the fact that this was outside the library for an entire spring and summer, not a single person complained. We put a few signs up explaining the project, how it was a project in process. And I think with the painting of the stencils on the plastic, people felt like it was okay. It wasn't too ugly, and it was allowed to remain. Now, these are some before and after pictures of what the site looked like, either when it was tarped or right after the tarp was removed. And you can see just 2 years later, like the density and the height of some of the plantings. On the left here, this meadow that shows the orange butterfly weed and the pink monarda, the bee balm, that was established from seed. That was actually just a seed mix I created. And that was put down in October of 2023. And by, July or August of 2025, it was, nearly 6 or 7 feet tall in some areas. So creating a meadow, when done correctly, is definitely not impossible. And then a lot of the rest of the site was established from plug or from, shrubs and trees that were planted at slightly larger sizes. You can see here some of those before and afters. The entire site was installed by volunteers, as well as the town's Department of Public Works. The Department of Public Works, their main role was to help us put down the tarp and to remove it and to fold it, as well as to put down the edging around the beds, to keep the beds separated from the path, and to deliver and place the large granite boulders on the site. But all of the different smaller plants, which was the majority of the site, the little plugs and small quarts and 1 gallons and 3 gallons, those were all planted by volunteers over the course of a weekend. So here's our data that we've gathered so far in Wellesley. As you can see, August and May of 2022 to 2023, that was before we touched the site. There were no species observed. The site was installed in September of 2023. By May of 2000, we didn't survey it in 2024 because it was like the first growing season. We wanted to give it some time. We went in 2025. And it was surveyed 3 times. May, sometime, I think it was around the 3rd or 4th week of May, the 1st week of July, and the 1st week of September. And we started to observe a lot of species as the summer kind of kicked in and we went into early fall. And we even observed a few of our targets, our species at risk of extinction. So here's the list of all the species that were observed on the site last year. 3 of them were target species, which is actually a pretty high number considering that I think we only observed about maybe 20 species total. So we're over 10% are target, which is great. Those are the more rare species or the more at-risk species. One of them was a record, a county record. It had never been observed in Norfolk County before. Wellesley is in Norfolk County, although it's on the border with Middlesex. So obviously this is demonstrating quite an improvement to the biodiversity of the site. We can look at interactions with bees and butterflies with plants on the site. There were 351 different interactions observed. That means we observed or collected 351 different bees and butterflies over the course of the summer using plants for something. Of those interactions, 91% were with native plant species. Over 38% of the interactions were with goldenrod. There were several species of goldenrod on the site, and unfortunately, a few of them, the person doing the surveys was not able to identify it to the species level. Some of them she was, some of them she wasn't. But we know that over 38% of the interactions were with goldenrod. Over nearly 30% of the interactions were with native thistle, which is somewhat widely regarded as an undesirable landscape plant due to the fact that it has extremely sharp thorns and it's over 9 feet tall. So you can see on the right here, that's me standing next to field thistle growing outside of my office. And it's a big plant. It's a big commitment, but it attracts a ton of bees. Less than 10% of all interactions were with non-native plant species. So we're doing really well as far as supporting diversity. Now, we also have an iNaturalist project for the site. We have a boundary that we uploaded to iNaturalist so that anyone's observation at any moment in time, if it's on the design site, it will be added to this project. And when I last checked it, which was, I think, in November, there had been 216 observations on the site going back to 2022. Before we did the planting, there were 62 observations, identifying 33 different species of plants and animals, and over a third of them were invasive or non-native plants or animals. For the observations that happened after the project was planted, there have been 154, and representing 97 species, and over 83% of those observations are natives. So you can literally see we're shifting the composition of the site from predominantly non-native to predominantly native. Also, we're increasing the diversity. We went from 33 species observed to 97. Before the project was installed, there were only 3 insect species observed on the site. After the project was installed, we've observed 39 insect species on the site. That is a 1,200% increase in insect species diversity. And that's only over a 2-year period. We're only talking about the difference between September, like basically the design was planted in September of 2023. All of these observations occurred, the ones that are post occurred, basically for the most part in 2024 and 2025, because, not much is going to be observed, in the fall and winter. So since the project was installed, we've multiplied the number of species observed by over 1,000%. We've also shifted the types of observations from being over 1/3 invasive or non-native to be over 83% native. So I encourage you all to download the iNaturalist app. You can download it on your phone or on your iPad or tablet. And please go to Simmons Park next to the library in Wellesley and take pictures, and go to the sites that you like to visit where you live, and add your mark. Help us get the data to know what's going on. I'm going to move a little bit faster now because I think I've been going a bit slow. I'm just going to show you guys a few other projects, but I'm going to move a little bit faster. So this project is from the Berkshires in the town of Egremont. Again, it was installed with volunteers in a public park that was mostly grass. A little bit of before and after, just to see what the site looked like. Now, before we did the project, Dr. Jagir surveyed it in the year 2020. And he observed 2 bumblebee species on the site. He only was surveying bumblebees. They're both common species, Bombus bimacculatus and Bombus impatiens. Then we did a citizen science workshop with Dr. Jagir in 2023, in which we taught people how to use their phones to identify bumblebees to the species level. And we again did more formal surveys in 2025 at the same level as what we did in Wellesley. Between 2023 and 2025, we have observed 8 different bumblebee species on the site, and 3 of them are targets, like species at risk of extinction. So that's a 350% increase in bumblebee species diversity over a 3 to 5 year period. Just a few pictures of people in the citizen science workshops helping us to get the data on the site. So again, you can see before the project, summer 2020, 2 species observed. They were not targets. They were common species, design installed. And then we started to see the targets at a pretty high number. This project here, Healthy Soil through Maximum Biodiversity, it's a collaboration with 7 farms in Western Massachusetts, ranging from small urban gardens and small urban parks all the way up to large, 500 more acre rural farm sites. And this project was supported by the Healthy Soils Initiative, which is part of the EEA. It's our Energy and Environmental Affairs wing of the state government. So here's the farms that we've been working with on this. It's been a collaboration with NOFA, Massachusetts, Nuestras Raíces in Holyoke, Red Fire Farm in Montague and Granby, Stonebridge Farm in Chesterfield, and Indian Line Farm in Egremont. What's cool about this project is these designs can be used by landowners across the state, and you don't even have to have a farm. So our vision for the project is based on our reading of the scientific literature that tells us that if you have a diverse arrangement of plants, particularly native plants, you're going to not only have a more productive ecosystem supporting more species, but you're also going to be storing more carbon. And native plant diversity is directly connected to the health of soil and the sequestering of carbon in the soil. So basically, we're going above ground and below ground. We're increasing biodiversity, and we're sequestering more carbon. So it's a win for pollinators, birds, and animals, and it's a win for the insects and other life under the soil, and it's a win for the climate mitigation. So while we acknowledge that development and loss of habitat, that loss of habitat that I was talking about at the beginning, it's inevitable. We're going to continuously lose habitat. We are not going to stop people from creating big box stores with large parking lots and malls and spreading suburban development across the face of the planet as our cities get bigger and we need to house our workforces and what have you. And we're certainly not going to stop people from turning forests and jungles into large farms to feed the world's growing population. However, if we can put back habitat at an equal or greater rate than the rate at which our habitat is being removed, or if we can farm and develop our landscapes in ways that retain pieces of habitat within them, like leaving pieces of nature in this development or in these farms, that is going to be the crucial aspect of human survival in this century. So we have created this project as a way to inform landowners, farmers, land managers, municipal employees. Here's a couple of designs that you could consider using to put back some habitat on the landscape. And here's ways you could consider to treat the land if you're going to be changing it or developing it. Scalable, replicable habitat designs. These are designs that are meant to be used by anyone. So before we began this project, we collected data. As I mentioned, we usually do that. But in this case, we didn't only collect data on which pollinators were on each of the sites, we also collected data on the soil of the sites, the health of the soil, the quality of the soil, and the amount of carbon in the soil. We worked with a team of scientific experts to build our list of target species for Western Massachusetts. This project, as far as pollinators goes, it targeted Hampshire, Franklin, Hampden, and Berkshire counties. We worked with Molly Jacobson and Michael Veet on bee species. Michael Veet is the author of the Checklist of Bees in Massachusetts. That's a great paper where you can find all the different bees that have been observed in the state. Molly Jacobson is a pollination ecologist that works at Landscape Interactions and has done a lot of our pollinator surveys over the past few years. We worked with Adam Cole, who's pictured here. He's a naturalist and a lepidopterist who is an expert in moths, and Stephen Whitebread, who also is a moth expert. And we worked with James Michelini and Elizabeth Crone, who were founders of the Tufts Pollinator Initiative, who are now based at University of California, Davis. And we identified there were 61 bee species, 38 butterfly species, and 55 moth species, all at risk of local extinction or lacking data in Western Mass, meaning they might not even be there anymore. We need to see if they show up. Or we know that they're at risk of not being here anymore because they haven't been observed at the same level as they once were historically. So here's some of our scientific advisors, Molly and Michael Veet. We had James Michelini and Elizabeth Crone for butterflies, and we had Adam Cole and Stephen Whitebread for moths. A pretty great group of people who are really experts in those fields. Then we did a series of workshops on soil testing and measuring soil health in the fields. And we also did planting with the farmers and with the community members. The site has a wide range of designs, has a wide range of site preparation guidelines, and now this is all going to be forthcoming in a public access document, which will be completed by the end of June. So if any of you want to make sure that you find out about that when it comes out, I would suggest that you go to my website, landscapeinteractions.com, and just sign up for the email list at the bottom of any of the main pages in the website. So let's look at some of the data we collected. At Red Fire Farm in Montague, which is a large rural vegetable and fruit farm, we observed 21 different pollinator species, including 2 of our target species, over 82 individual pollinators which were observed. And 68 of the interactions between those pollinators were with native plants. Now let's compare that to Liberty Hill Townhouses. That's a small urban park in the center of Springfield, surrounded by asphalt, concrete, what have you. Only 3 species were observed, 0 were target species. There were only 7 individual pollinators observed over the course of the growing season, and there were 0 interactions with native plants. So this is sort of representing the 2 extremes of the sites that we're working with. Looking at carbon, the gray circles on this map represent the sites that had the highest levels of soil organic carbon, and the yellow circles represent the sites that had that based on the number of pollinator species. So the larger the yellow circle, the more pollinators. So you can actually see by this map, the sites that were in urban Springfield had the highest carbon, as well as in Holyoke, followed by Stonebridge Farm and Indian Line Farm. And that's because those sites did not have a lot of disturbance to the soil. They were sites that were either in perennial vegetation, like lawn in a park or grazing pasture at Stonebridge Farm, or wetland buffer areas in Indian Line Farm where they're not allowed to plow, or in the case of whereas if we look at Red Fire Farm, which had the lowest carbon, that was a crop field that had been plowed continuously up until about 5 or 6 years ago. Whereas they had the highest number of pollinator species, the highest diversity. So the conclusion from this is not so, black and white. You can have a high level of pollinator species diversity representing sort of a high level of biodiversity. It's a proxy for biodiversity, but you might not have good soil quality or high soil carbon. We're trying to accomplish both. So it'll be interesting to see how this project shakes out when all of the plantings are installed, because on some of the sites, we're working with sites that had 0 pollinator species observed, but pretty good carbon, versus sites that had 21 species observed, but very low carbon. So landscape management directly influences soil carbon, like whether you're disturbing the soil, basically, and what kind of vegetation is on it. Whereas the context of the site, the location, the context, and the management, they're all interwoven to affect biodiversity. We did a soil health scoring system for our 10 sites, and the numbers that are the highest, this is out of 100, had the highest soil health, and that was looking at physical, biological, and chemical attributes. So the top site was an urban community garden where they're growing vegetables in raised beds in Springfield, and the lowest was in Granby, a site of an old farmhouse where they're building a new store. Here's some of our design solutions for the project. So as I mentioned, the concept is scalable, replicable designs that could be used by anyone. This is an example of a hedgerow design. It's about 12 feet wide, 50 feet long. It could just be one, or you could repeat it, a dozen times across a larger field. But it has a wide diversity of vegetation within it. At the same time, it's only about 10 feet tall, so it doesn't shade the crop fields. This is our site in Springfield, the small urban park. These are some pictures of existing conditions. We did landscape analysis. We decided to focus on this small purple rectangle in the middle of the site that had the most sun, that was on top of existing grass. This is our design for the site. Essentially, it's 3 container plantings. So 3 portable raised beds that are 2 feet tall, 2 feet wide, and 4 feet long. They cost about $75 from Home Depot. You can build it in about an hour with a screwdriver, and you can create these beautiful ornamental native perennial gardens featuring a mix of different native flowers and grasses. So this is suitable for small urban sites. It could be suitable for restaurants that have outdoor seating. It could be suitable for sites where people are renting and they're not sure how long they're going to be there. What's cool about these planters is that the bottom of them is open. So eventually the roots of the plants will reach to the ground, and they will also start to interact with the different microorganisms in the soil of the park, improving the carbon of the park and the health of the soil by opening up the soil with more species life and more ability for nutrients to cycle through the roots up and down, in the gaps created by the root systems. So just to give an example, one of these planters, the design is essentially in the middle, you have little blue stem, you have New England blazing star, Prunella vulgaris, you have butterfly weed, and you have lupin. So it's sort of like a shorter, drought-tolerant, full sun type of planting. We also have a taller version that features big blue stem, Joe Pyeweed, smooth aster, purple giant hyssop, and bee balm. And then we came up with one that could do well in part shade with river oats, zizia, Penstemon digitalis, another aster. I don't know I can't remember the common name, and wood mint, Blophilia ciliata. This is our site in Montague, the large crop field. And the farmer wanted something that would be productive, that he could harvest, but at the same time that would support, pollinators and biodiversity. So what we came up with is a short meadow comprised of species that will not grow to be above 4 feet, with the canopy being these very widely spaced native nut and fruit trees that could be harvested. So we have serviceberry, American plum, beach plum, Western hazelnut, and then we also have chestnut. And the chestnuts are the only species in this entire project that are not fully native. They're a hybrid between the native American chestnut and non-native chestnut, because unfortunately, it's very hard to establish native chestnuts because of chestnut blight. So we made a small compromise with this one. This site in Chesterfield, we featured a portion of a pasture that we converted into essentially a native grazing pasture. So it's basically like a meadow, but comprised of plants that would be palatable to the cows and the sheep that they have on site. And on the south, a riparian buffer along the pond. This is what the riparian buffer design looks like. It consists of a wide range of species, including elderberry, red maple, pussy willow, mulberry, tussock sedge, alder, American cranberry, and even pickerel weed in the water's edge. What's really nice about this is that it's doing a couple of other things besides supporting these insects. It's also preventing the animals from going into the pond to drink water, which then, prevents the pond from becoming polluted and growing algae and other similar issues. At the same time, it's providing shade for the animals in the summer, with the larger shrubs and trees being on the south side of where their grazing pasture is. And here's a couple of different seed mixes we created. So lastly, I'll look with you at Nuestras Raíces, that's in Holyoke along the Connecticut River. We are doing 2 designs there. One of them is still in process. It's a rain garden, sort of like a floodable playscape. But the one I'm going to show you here is a windbreak that is going to be situated in the middle of a large open area filled with crop fields. And it's really right in the center. So it's helping that wind, slow that wind down in the middle point between north and south. At the same time, it's providing a bit of shade. So in the summer months, smaller vegetables like lettuces or arugula could be grown in the dappled shade on the northern aspect of the windbreak. This windbreak contains a wide range of trees. It has serviceberry, it has dwarf chestnut, hackberry, redbud, eastern red cedar, 2 different species of native plum, including beach plum and American plum. It has chokecherry, scrub oak, sumac, and then a couple of different upland willows. And it's got a lot of different shrubs as well, including aronia, yellow wild indigo, New Jersey tea, Western hazelnut, northern bush honeysuckle, St. John's wort, native roses, blackberries, raspberries, and meadowsweet, as well as some grasses and flowers. And we also created a design that is all native wetland shrubs that this farmer wanted to plant them in a row with row cover so that she could actually harvest cuttings from them to put into floral bouquets. So it has things like willows, buttonbush, winterberry, aronia. Some of them produce fruit, which can be used for, value-added products like tinctures or syrups like elderberry. We also designed a fence line restoration planting. So this could be like really anyone that's looking to fill in a gap. It could be a privacy screen. It could be a woodland edge planting. It's got things like serviceberry, gray birch, hawthorn, redbud, poplar, chokecherry, oak, dogwood, sumac. So quite a wide range of different designs and quite a wide range of different landscapes, everything from small urban to large rural. We have riparian, wetland, upland, open field, forest edge. And so all of this will be published by the end of June. You can sign up on our website if you want to stay abreast. I'm also presenting at the NOFA conference next weekend at UMass Amherst on February 28th about this specifically. And we're going to have a roundtable discussion with the farmers. And I think I'm going to end it here. I feel like I've gone on a pretty good amount of time, and I'm sure some of you have questions. So we'll skip the New York project and just go straight to the last page, summarize. And so essentially, we're trying to, with our work at Landscape Interactions, we want to measure the success of our landscapes. We don't want to just say, oh, these are diverse because I said so, or because I know what I'm talking about. We're saying it because we're measuring before and after impacts. We're looking at pollinator species before, pollinator species after planting. Usually we wait about 2 years until after it's been installed to show the differences. And we're looking at diversity as a metric of success or failure. Lack of diversity would be failure. In some cases, we're also measuring soil. We've increasingly been measuring both as our baseline, and we endeavor to continue to measure it in the future. So plant selection supports species richness and diversity across functional traits, trophic levels, and animal groups. So we could be looking at bees, but we also could be supporting, birds and other wildlife. Science informing the design process, the selection of plants, and measuring the results. And most importantly, every project has a maintenance plan and a management plan. So here's our website. This is where you can check out our work, sign up for future updates, and looking forward to hearing some of your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan, for presenting. It was a great presentation. Not sure if anyone had questions they'd like to ask right now, or if people are okay with going through the chat. I have you here. I have some questions from the chat. One person asked, why would the two extirpated bumblebee species never return?
Well, usually when a species is extirpated, like to be like designated as extirpated, there's been like extensive survey efforts on the parts of teams of professional scientists, like basically, scouring the entire state looking for them in like all different types of land use. They're looking at historical observations, and they're trying to see if those species are still in those same places or if they're in other nearby places. And they're looking across the region. When a species becomes extirpated, it basically means, look, we've spent the last, 10 or more years, sometimes it's 20 or more years. We don't see them. They're not showing up anymore. None of our survey efforts are finding them, but we know that they were here before because we have this historical data. So we are now concluding that they're extirpated. They're no longer in this region. They're no longer in this state. Once it gets that designation, it means that there's an extremely high likelihood, if not absolute certainty, that that species no longer exists in that place. And so why would they not return? Because they can't travel, hundreds or thousands of miles. They only can go a certain distance. So if they're not being found, they're not being found. And they're not coming back because they can't just like jump on a plane and come back to Massachusetts. Now, of course, someone could, illegally gather them in like a place like Wisconsin and bring them to Massachusetts and try to establish them, but that's not really, that's not considered to be good conservation practices, to be like moving at-risk species from one area to another.
Interesting. Another question is, so flight time refers to when they arrive, right?
Flight time is the season in which they are active, like where they will be found in a place. So like in Massachusetts, there's certain flight times for certain butterfly species, like year after year, they show up in that part of the year, whether it's like, May and June, or June to August, or maybe it's July to September. That's their flight time. It's the time of year that they emerge as adults and they fly, which is different from the time of year when their eggs are laid and they're caterpillars.
Right. Next question is, did you have to water the Wellesley site?
The Wellesley site was okay. The trees were watered with tree bags, those green bags that you attach to the bottom. You just fill them with a hose once a week and then they slow drip. They used tree bags for, I think, the first 2 years. Other than that, the site was only watered once, believe it or not. It was
Wow.
watered. It was watered, I think, like once the first month that we planted it. And then we kind of like went into like a rainy period because at that point it was October. And then we went into winter. And then the next year we had plenty of rain. And the plants are doing really well there. Most of our sites, I would say the vast majority of our sites, if not all of them, usually only need to be watered the first year, if at all. Like we have a site in Martha's Vineyard where I think they watered it quite a bit the first year because it was actually installed in June, like when it's like gets super dry out there. They watered the hell out of it the first summer, but by the second summer, it was just very occasional. And the plants were very, very well established. Sometimes if you overwater, so it depends like on the design. What I try to do is I try to, select plants that are always appropriate for the conditions of the site. So, I didn't really talk about this a lot, but whenever we do these projects, we are looking at the full range of landscape conditions before we do the planting. We're looking at soils, we're looking at hydrology, slopes, drainage, how much sun it gets. We're mapping the sun across the growing season on the site with the shade of the buildings and the trees, taking that all into consideration using LiDAR and other, geographic technologies. And then we're selecting plants that are appropriate for the conditions of the site. So I'm not designing sites like looking through the lens of this is always going to be irrigated. I'm designing sites through the lens of this is what would grow here well without needing to be watered. And obviously the first year, you never know, you might need to water if there's a drought, but after that, usually you don't need to water, with the exception of sometimes trees take a couple of extra years to really establish. But the vast majority of our sites, they really don't need much watering after the first season. Now, if you wanted to like have a wetland planting and like no matter what, you're just stuck on this, I need to have this wetland planting and the site is not wet, then you might be watering forever.
Huh. All right. So our next question was, did you have problems with rabbits eating the small seedlings and plants before they became established?
In Wellesley, yes, we did have the rabbits eating, in particular, the scrub oak and the New England blazing star and the low bush blueberry in particular is what I remember. I mean, I'm sure they were also eating other things. There was some deer browse pressure on the willows and the spirea, but that all sort of wasn't as much of an issue by the second year. We put a few small cages up, mostly for the low bush blueberry and the scrub oak. And that was about it.
Mm.
It's just sort of out there.
Another question here at the Wellesley site. Did you leave most of the natives in place over the winter to support local wildlife? If so, what was the reaction from the library and locals in the area?
The reaction regarding what specifically?
Uh, I think um they asked if you left most of the natives in place over the winter to
Oh
support the
yeah, we
wildlife, and how was the reaction from the
yeah,
locals?
so our partner in Wellesley, like the owner of the land and the partner for the project, like where we, basically our client is the Wellesley Natural Resources Commission, the NRC, who if you aren't familiar with them, they're a very good regional partner for the kind of work you guys are doing as well. Very focused on conservation and wildlife and, minimizing water usage on landscapes. They were very keen they are very keen for this park to be wild and to be messy. Like they're okay with that. So we don't cut back in the fall at all. We just leave it. So far, so good. I'm thinking that this spring, I'm going to recommend that we just mow the meadow down like once in the spring because we haven't mowed it at all since it was established by seed, except for when it was in the initial establishment phase with the cover crop the first season. And I'm also going to recommend that we weed whack occasionally the bee lawn replacement, like the native lawn replacement, because that area is like very, very rich in flowers and very beautiful, but it does tend to get like a little tall if it gets to be about like a foot or a foot and a half to 2 feet. And I think that's a little bit too tall. So if we were to maintain that with weed whacking, like perhaps weed whacking every 2 months, it would just kind of be like a miniature version of that. With the meadows do need occasional mowing, or if not burning is ideal. I don't think we can get away with a burn in a suburban park in Wellesley. I'd love it. So that's going to be my recommendation. But I'm not really big into the fall cleanup or the spring cleanup. I typically don't really do much of that.
All right. Another question was, what are the historical sources for determining what pollinator species should be in an area?
Historical sources are going to be, wherever you can get historical observations of those species, either in that exact town or city or nearby. So it's going to be, there's websites where you can find them, like GBIF and NatureServe. There's museum collections. So schools like Harvard, Yale, UMass to a certain extent, Cornell, they have like these extensive collections of insects going back to the 1800s. And we are combing those records to find any observations in our given town or in our given county. Usually we're looking at either the county level or usually we're looking at the county level. And so we're oftentimes going to these digital databases where the museum records are stored. And if they're not available, we're contacting directly the museum collections curators. And we're also looking at literature, peer-reviewed papers that have perhaps focused on a particular place. In the case of butterflies, we're almost exclusively going off of the Massachusetts Butterfly Club data. They have been doing statewide surveys of butterflies consistently since 1991. So that's a really good metric for, showing the differences. And then we're looking for contemporary at anywhere you can find observations from iNaturalist to these same websites that I mentioned, which continue to have, new observations added to them. And you can typically search based on date, location, species, etc.
I had one more question from the chat. What is the carbon piece that was mentioned toward the end? I've heard about the idea of trapping carbon and keeping it in the ground. Is this what you're referring to? Can you explain more about this?
I mean, that's I think what they're saying is they're talking about carbon sequestration, perhaps. So carbon sequestration is storing carbon in the earth so it doesn't, go into the atmosphere and contribute to climate change. And yes, plants do that naturally. And our research has found that there's a direct correlation between diversity of plants and higher levels of carbon being stored in the soil. And even more so if you're using native plant species. So to summarize, planting a wide range of different types of native plants, trees, shrubs, grasses, flowers, cool season grasses, warm season grasses, all combined is going to sequester more carbon than having just like, one or two or three or four different species. Also, then you have within that, there's differences in the type of plant and how the carbon remains. So for example, trees store a lot of carbon, but they store a lot of their carbon in the wood, right? If you cut down a tree, that carbon goes back into the atmosphere. Grasses and flowers, like in a meadow, they store most of their carbon in their roots. So even if you cut them back, the carbon remains. So like it's important to say this because like if you like brush hog your meadow or you pick a flower like in your garden, you're not releasing carbon into the atmosphere like the way that you would if you cut a tree down. Does that make sense? Because trees have a different system because they're woody and they have different materials. So the way that they store their carbon, a lot of their carbon is in the above ground portion, the portion of that we see, the tree, the trunk, the branches. Whereas a lot of our herbaceous vegetation, like things like, milkweed and little blue stem, they're actually storing most of their carbon in their roots. So if you're not digging out the plant and removing all of their roots, if you're just cutting it or burning it, you're not releasing the carbon with regards to perennial vegetation. So I like to talk about that because, like, let's say we have a wildfire. There were pretty big wildfires. I think it was 2 years ago outside of Boston. We had like major wildfires in Lynn. That was on the news in the fall of 2024. There were also at the same time, like the same exact week, wildfires in the Berkshires. I think a couple hundred acres burned down outside of Great Barrington. And there were wildfires in New York City, all in the same month. There were wildfires in Prospect Park in Brooklyn and in Inwood Park in Manhattan, as well as in New Jersey. So our landscapes need to be climate adaptive, like our climate's changing. So if a certain place is forest right now, but that forest burns in the next wildfire, we are going to be releasing that carbon into the atmosphere and contributing to climate change. If that forest was a field, a meadow, or a grassland, if it burns, it's not going to release the carbon into the atmosphere. The carbon will remain in the ground, in the roots of those plants. So planning for climate change in some places in the world means cutting down trees to create fire breaks or barriers to the fire spreading. And that can actually benefit because now we're opening up opportunities in the landscape for a wider diversity of vegetation. Like we can put in a meadow where there was just before like shade, right? Like a canopy. And as we know, a lot of our forests have very, very low quality understory vegetation. Like most of them in Massachusetts have very little of plants growing in the understory. It's just trees with like very little underneath. If there is something underneath, it tends to be invasive, barberry or buckthorn or, things like that, bittersweet vines. And that's because we have deer browse. The deer are over browsing the forests and they're preventing the new trees from growing, especially things like oak and maple. And they're leaving things that they don't want to eat, which tend to be invasive species. So sometimes people get really, really concerned about, logging, for example. But logging in some cases can actually benefit biodiversity because it opens up gaps in the forest for other things to grow, which will attract other animals like other insects and birds if it regenerates. And those landscapes could be opportunities to prevent further forest fires, if that makes sense.
All right, thank you. And thank you for everyone for holding on. She had a further question. The same person, how does this carbon sequestration relate to the slide you showed about pollinators and carbon found at different sites?
So if the literature tells us that high diversity of native vegetation contributes to higher levels of carbon sequestration in the soil, we also know that a high diversity of native vegetation contributes to a high level of diversity of pollinators. So we're doing both simultaneously. If we're planting a wide diversity of vegetation, we are attracting a wide diversity of pollinators, and we are sequestering more carbon in the soil than what was there before. With all of our sites, the vegetation was not high diversity, with maybe one exception. So to give the example of the community garden in Springfield, they had very high levels of carbon, but there was no vegetation. It was just wood chips year after year that were piled or like mulched on top of the former grass that had been, covered with them after many years of gardening. So yeah, it had a lot of carbon, but it didn't have diversity. So we're trying to do both. We don't just want carbon. Carbon alone is not enough. I'm sort of tried to allude to that at the beginning, how biodiversity is an ally in responding to climate change, because our ecosystems actually help stabilize the climate, and they're more resilient to disturbances like flooding, drought, wildfire. It's very complex, but essentially we need a diverse landscape to be resilient to climate change. Like we can't depend upon like one species of plant. We also need a diverse landscape to support diversity of pollinators and other species like birds and animals. And thankfully, both of those are also going to support higher levels of soil carbon, because higher diversity of native vegetation leads to higher diversity of soil carbon. So our goals are like sort of these two parallel tracks. We are increasing the diversity of the vegetation. We are planting only native species, with the exception of the chestnuts on that one farm, which are hybrid. We are choosing our plants based on the pollinators that need them, that are at the most risk. And we are measuring how that changes pollinator communities and soil over time. And our goal is to increase the carbon of the soil, increase the diversity of the species of pollinators, and to increase the health of the soil. And it's all being done simultaneously with these diverse plantings that are based on the plants that the pollinators need. I hope that's clear.
If you want to unmute and have your question.
Yeah, thank you. Evan, have you you said you were going to release that info, that study that you did on the grazing animals and the pasture. I think it was the pasture study that you did with native plants.
I was referring to the Healthy Soils project with the farmers.
Okay.
It's based on the 10 sites I showed in Springfield, Chesterfield, Egremont. That's the one that's we're talking about. So it involves one grazing field, but it also involves other things like riparian buffer plantings, hedgerows, meadows, agroforestry. That's all going to wrap up by the end of June.
Okay.
And it will be like a downloadable PDF that will include all the data collected on the 10 sites, the designs, the plants that we used in the designs. It will include our site preparation guidelines for each site, which are totally different for each site, and our management timeline. So for example, some sites were tilled once or twice and then planted in cover crops for a season, like various cover crop rotations. And then we seeded the meadow into that in the fall. Other sites we tarped. Other sites we are removing the vegetation manually. Some of them it's container plantings, which doesn't require much site preparation. So it's like the idea is that there'll be like a wide range of approaches that would be hopefully of interest to a wide range of people.
Yeah, I mean it's crazy how different each site can be. I'm just interested in like I guess what have you seen like with animals grazing? Like, is it possible to have pollinators in your grazing animals? Like, how do you do it kind of where you can still get caterpillars and
Yeah,
bees on the same pasture land and they're grazing? Because I know like a lot of the introduced grasses, like a lot of them are, kind of European grasses, but I know
right,
we got the
right.
little blue stem, we got the switchgrass, so it's like how do you
Yes,
graze those, but also
yes,
pollinators?
yes. That's a really good question. I do have a few slides about that. Um, I, um, I kind of, have to pick and choose how much I can share in a given presentation. Like I thought I didn't include it for this presentation because I thought this group maybe was more like suburban landowners. I wasn't quite sure who my audience was,
Well, I'm
but
in the city, so I'm far away from a pasture.
yeah. So I'll show you. I have a project I did on this. So let's go here. Let me share my screen. So yeah, this is a project that I did on my own property for 2 years. I called it Grazing for Biodiversity. So this is my land in Leiden near Greenfield, Massachusetts. Um, so we're in the hills, we're in the hill towns in the Connecticut River Valley, and the field is about 8 acres surrounded by forest. So we got a grant from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to do prescribed burning, and we burned our field, and then like immediately we put the livestock on it, which is called patch burn grazing. And it actually is a really well-regarded process for improving the diversity of open fields and grasslands because the livestock will go and preferentially graze the things that are growing the first out of the burn. And since in this case, we're burning in the spring, they're going to go to those cool season grasses and they're going to eliminate them while the other native grasses are still establishing, because they're more warm season. So the effect of this was very beneficial for things like little blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, goldenrods, asters, all the different native flowers, because the livestock were sort of targeting the things that we wanted to be small and short, and then letting the other things get big. And what we did with them was we moved them every week to an entirely different block within the field. So I divided the field into 6 blocks. Actually, I divided into 12 blocks. Half of the field I left ungrazed, like I just let it regenerate after the burn. And then the other half I divided into 6, and each portion was about 3/4 of an acre. So every week I would open up, that portion, that 3/4 of an acre portion, and I would let the livestock in, and they would only get to go to the first third. And then after like 1 or 2 days, they would get access to the second third. And then by the end of the week, they would have access to the whole thing. So that's like a pretty typical process of rotational grazing. And then after the end of the week, they would get to a brand new block. And they were all contiguous, going from the top of the hill to the bottom. And then at the end of the 6-week period, I'd have to walk them all the way back up to the top of the hill and start again. So because we were moving the livestock pretty quickly, like they always had access to something new every 2 or 3 days max, if not every 1 or 2 days, we did not deplete like the plants and like overgraze them. And so by the end of the summer, all of these species that you see listed here on the right, they're all native. They were all in the field, and they all produce flowers and seeds. So we can ascertain that they also supported pollinators because that's what the pollinators are going for. They're going for the flowers, and the seeds are the product of the pollination. We also were observing pollinators at the same time. And then after that, after 2 seasons of that, I mowed the site down all the way. You can see it's very dominated by little blue stem, as you can see from these pictures. And then I raked it, and then I created a few different seed mixes for the site, including a very like drought tolerant full sun mix, an area for like more moister edges that are shadier. We had like a bit of like a wet, like a sort of swale area where it was like very moist. And then we had like a dry shade mix. And we seeded them across the landscape in the winter. And then the seeds started to emerge the next summer. And by the second growing season, you could really see that the diversity was really starting to change from the addition of those seeds. And I've been just kind of following the site, year after year. And this year I'm endeavoring to burn it again. I'm waiting to hear back if we get the funding to do another burn. And I think this time it's going to be extremely beneficial because some of the seeds have been in the ground for 3 or 4 years, and they're basically activated by the burn. The burn opens up gaps in the landscape where certain plants can come out that normally wouldn't show up unless they had a gap, like lupin. Because what the burn does is it eliminates the litter, like the leaf litter and all the thatch from the dead grasses and flowers year after year that you get when you do brush hogging or grazing. So it's sort of a combined approach involving, observations, grazing, mowing occasionally, very occasionally, like maybe like once every like 2 to 4 years, and burning when possible. That's like sort of the recipe for success. And the livestock do eat a lot of these plants. Like this field, like maybe in these pictures looks like it's like mostly native, but I would say it's still got at least like 25% non-native cool season, European type grasses and clover and stuff like that. And so you can introduce the livestock in and they will find plenty of things to eat. And they will also eat some of the native plants, especially when they're in the early stages of growth. And, when I brought some of my sheep to slaughter after 2 seasons of them being in this field without any hay, except during the winter, they were like 180 pounds, the sheep. So they were quite large. So they definitely were eating very well. And I wasn't giving them any grain, just grazing outside in, April or May, let's say May to November, and then starting to get hay, like, towards like the middle of November through, the end of April. So I hope that maybe provides a little bit of insight into that project.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
We also were able to observe the Bombus fervidus on the site after this grazing study, which is one of those at-risk bumblebees, in Massachusetts that might become extirpated. So it's a direct correlation with the grazing and the seeding and the landscape management.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, I also like it that you're managing with fire, which is I find really interesting because like they even say that for like the Midwest, the Great Plains states, there was often like birding, and then the buffalo come after, and then it's like, but you can get that in the small scale. It's pretty cool and encouraging to see.
Yeah, I hope that people become more comfortable with that because burning is really a great way to maintain a meadow. It prevents the thatching from building up, and inevitably if you have too much thatching, you're just going to get a smaller group of species that are going to do well and the rest are just going to kind of fade away. I'd love to do the burn in Wellesley. It also knocks back a lot of the weeds. Sometimes it kills the weeds, or at least it knocks them back enough that the natives can take over. It does a really good job of like kind of shifting the balance more towards the native species.
Have you tried like large animals, trying to mimic the megafauna or something, seeing what happens?
Yeah, I thought about it. I sort of needed to wind down the farm operation a little bit because it was just becoming a lot of work and I was doing most of the work alone. Buffalo or bison, their native range didn't really extend to New England. I think it went about as far as maybe Pennsylvania or New York. So we're not really in their like native area. Not that they couldn't be really beneficial, I think the closest proxy that we have are the Scottish Highland cattle,
Hmm,
which are the ones that have the really large horns. They operate pretty similarly because they're grazers and browsers. So they'll eat like a lot of woody plants, especially like young trees or shrubs that are establishing. They do a really good job of like removing invasive shrubs and vines, but then
really?
they also graze, the grasses and the forbs. So the farm that we're partnering with on the soils project, they have Scottish Highland cattle and sheep. And that's a really good combination for, I think, for a biodiverse grazing protocol. So
Yeah, I
that
just
should be
love those
pretty
ideas
interesting.
of like rewilding and stuff. And I've heard that like, well, maybe it applies more to dry lands, but like the grazing of large cattle, like I don't know, wildebeest or something, like they would trample that
Yes,
thatch that would build
yes.
up, and then poo on it and whatnot, and it would stop it from building up.
Yeah, I mean the grazing is really great. And maybe one day I'll bring it back to my land. Um, but right now, we're really just looking at burning and like occasional, very occasional mowing and selective invasive species removal. That's been our approach at the moment. But thank you all for attending, and
Yeah.
thank you, Jonas, for your questions, and everyone else. And you can always email me, Evan at landscapeinteractions.com. You've got my contact, obviously. You're welcome to pass it on to everyone if they want. And we'll do the rain garden tour in the spring.
All right. Sounds great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Evan, for presenting. It was so educational, and we will have this up on our website and our YouTube channel. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great night.
Okay, bye everyone. Thank you.
Bye.